The cold blade catches the light for just a second before it disappears into the dirt. A rusted hilt. A whisper of iron. No ceremony, no markings at first. But then, after brushing away the soil from centuries ago, there it is. Etched in. Faint but defiant letters. Plus ULFBERHT plus dot. You probably won't survive this next part. Not if you're a 9th century warrior facing this weapon in battle. Because this sword is no ordinary sword. It's stronger than anything that should have existed. In its time, it cuts deeper. It bends but doesn't break. It hums with a kind of ancient intelligence. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the Vikings. If you're intrigued by forgotten legends, impossible technology, and quiet mysteries buried beneath the frost, subscribe to the video sharing channel now so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, imagine kneeling by a Norwegian riverbank in the chill of early spring. A local farmer is digging a drainage trench when his spade hits something solid, not stone, not wood. Something dense, metallic. They call in the archaeologists, who brush and tap and carefully reveal a blade, wrapped in rust but elegant in shape. It's a sword, clearly Viking, found buried beside bones, beads, and a broken buckle. Nothing about it should stand out until they find the inscription. Those letters, plus ULFBERHT plus. Clean, deeply etched. Strikingly modern, experts begin to ask questions. How could a sword like this survive more than 1,000 years in such shape? Why is the metal so pure? In the lab, it gives up its first secret. The sword contains levels of carbon that shouldn't exist in European metalwork of the time. The iron is almost completely free of slag, the impurities that usually plague ancient weapons. This isn't bog iron hammered in a smoky forge. This is crucible steel, a material that requires temperatures above 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to make. No one in Northern Europe was supposed to have that ability in the 800s. One of the researchers jokes that it's like finding a rocket booster welded to a Roman chariot. Everyone laughs, but not for long. Because that's exactly what this is, a technology that doesn't fit the timeline, and that's when the mystery of the Ulfberht begins. Now imagine holding that sword. It's not polished like a museum replica. It's blackened in places, chipped in others, but the balance is exquisite. You lift it, and it feels alive. The center of gravity pulls you forward, urges the blade to swing before you're even ready. It's a weapon that wants to fight. Funny thing about archaeologists, they don't usually like mysteries. They prefer evidence, clean dates, consistent methods. But Ulfberht? Ulfberht doesn't play by their rules. The name itself raises eyebrows. Why would a Viking sword be inscribed with a Frankish name, possibly Germanic in origin, written in Latin script? And why are there dozens of them spread across Northern Europe, each one slightly different? In Germany, another blade is found. In Finland, 2 more. In Estonia, one is uncovered in a boat burial, wrapped in fur beside amber beads. Each sword bears the same curious name. But their quality varies. Some are nearly perfect, others less. So, historians still debate whether the one found near the riverbank is the original or one of many copies. Because that's another twist to the tale. Some of these swords are fakes, forged to look like Ulfberht's, but made from inferior iron. Even in the Viking Age, branding mattered. A name could mean the difference between fear and defeat, between living another day and not. Picture Viking chieftain walking into a gathering, the Ulfberht at his side. It's not just a tool of war, it's a symbol, a flex, like pulling up in a Bugatti while the rest are still on horseback. Warriors would trade everything for it. Some probably died for the chance to carry one, but here's the oddest thing. The location of the first sword wasn't even a battlefield. It was a peaceful grave, the resting place of someone not quite rich, but not forgotten either. This man had no crown, no kingdom, just this sword, which means either he earned it in blood, or it was passed to him for reasons long since lost. And then there's the soil itself. The blade was buried in mineral-rich ground, unusually well-drained. Perfect conditions for preservation. Almost like someone wanted it to be found one day. A quiet question hangs over the entire discovery. Was this burial accidental or intentional? As news of the find spreads, more old records are dusted off. A monk's journal from the 1100s mentions the blades of light from the north, swords that could cut through iron and never dull. He doesn't name them, but the description fits too well. And then there's the map. In a university basement in Oslo, a graduate student finds a sketch from the 17th century. It shows a series of dotted lines, trade routes, but one path is circled in faded ink. It leads from the east, through the Volga, up into Scandinavia, and near the curve of a river. A symbol, a sword. The idea begins to form. What if the Ulfberht wasn't made in the north at all? What if it traveled like a ghost? The student is laughed at, gently. Don't chase shadows, his professor says. But he keeps digging, and in the next part of this story, that single name carved into steel, Ulfberht, will lead to a discovery that rewrites the Viking legacy. It's not just a word. It's a brand, a signature, a whisper that echoes across iron and centuries, plus Ulfberht plus dot. But who or what was Ulfberht? The name is stamped, not carved, into the metal. It appears in capital letters with 2 crosses on either end. Some are perfectly aligned. Others are awkward, the letters uneven. That detail might seem small, but it hints at something bigger. Not all Ulfberht swords came from the same hands. So now the question sharpens. Was Ulfberht a single blacksmith, a family line, a workshop, or an entire movement? The evidence suggests something strange. The earliest known Ulfberht swords date back to around 800 AD, during the peak of the Viking expansion. But the name itself is not Norse, it's Frankish, possibly from what is now France or Western Germany. This opens the first real crack in the story. Vikings were traders, raiders, and survivors, but they were not expert metallurgists. At least, not by the standards required to forge a sword like this, which begs the question, did they make the Ulfberhts, or did they steal them? Historians still debate whether the name Ulfberht refers to a monk, a swordsmith, or regional abbey protected by the Carolingian Empire. Some even claim it was a religious order, smuggling knowledge under the banner of holy silence. But what's undeniable is this. Someone, somewhere had the ability to produce a level of craftsmanship, almost a millennium ahead of its time. And they left a name behind. A few centuries later, during the medieval period, the name Ulfberht would become synonymous with quality like the Rolex of its day. Warriors would pay handsomely, sometimes in gold, land, or loyalty for the right to carry one. A true Ulfberht was more than a weapon. It was status. It was fear. But here's where the story gets weirder. Not all swords bearing the Ulfberht inscription were made equally. Some were forged from high-carbon crucible steel, a material requiring extreme heat and technical precision. These were the real deal, stronger, more flexible, and sharper than anything else on the battlefield. Others were fakes. They carried the same name but were made from bog iron, cheaper, brittle, filled with impurities. The inscriptions on these blades are often misspelled. Some read plus Ulfberht plus or plus Ulfberht plus. Subtle, easy to overlook in the chaos of war. But telling. It's like buying a designer handbag at a market stall. Looks real from far away, but under pressure, it cracks. The presence of these imitation swords raises an unsettling idea that even in the Viking Age, there were counterfeiters. Not just of coins, but of legends. And that makes the original Ulfberhts even more mysterious. Think of the craftsmanship needed. Crucible steel wasn't just rare, it was practically impossible to make in 9th century Europe. The process involves heating iron and carbon in sealed containers until they form an alloy that's both strong and flexible. The technology existed, but not in Scandinavia. Not officially. That type of steel was made in Persia, India, and Central Asia, places far outside the Viking world. So how did a Frankish named sword, forged with Middle Eastern technology, end up in the hands of Norse raiders? One theory takes us into the heart of the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne, Emperor of the West, ruled with both the sword and the scripture. His reign emphasized literacy, Christian expansion, and tight control over trade, including weaponry. Exporting advanced metalwork was banned. The idea was simple: keep the best tools in loyal hands, but trade routes were leaky. And monasteries weren't just religious centers. They were hubs of information, wealth, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Enter the monks. Some believe that monks trained in both prayer and metallurgy secretly passed along the knowledge of crucible steel. These monks, disillusioned with imperial control or swayed by northern gold, may have shared or smuggled fragments of a lost technology to Viking allies. It sounds outlandish. But then again, so does finding a space-age sword in a medieval grave. There's one story part myth, part footnote in a dusty manuscript of a monk named Theodoric, who traveled through the Rhine Valley in 825 AD. He was known to be obsessed with metallurgy, and his final writings describe a metal without fault, forged in silence, that sings when struck. He died mysteriously not long after. His grave? Still missing. Of course, this could be coincidence. But coincidences pile up fast when Ulfberht is involved. Now, let's lighten things up for a second. Imagine a Viking blacksmith hunched over an anvil, grumbling to himself. They want what kind of steel? From where? And how hot? He squints at the sketch some traveling monk handed him, nearly sets his beard on fire trying to replicate the heat, then gives up and scratches plus Ulfberht plus into the blade anyway. Close enough, right? But here's the kicker: even the fakes held power. Whether real or counterfeit, the Ulfberht name meant something. And that power, reputation, belief, fear, sometimes mattered more than metal itself. Still, the real Ulfberhts remained elusive. Tracing their origins was like chasing shadows through fog. Each discovery led to another dead end. A new sword, a new twist, and then a pattern emerged. The earliest authentic Ulfberths seemed to radiate from a central region, modern-day Fulda, in Hesse, Germany. Fulda was a monastic stronghold, famous for its scriptorium and, strangely, its ironwork. Several swords were found within 100 miles of the area. Coincidence? Maybe, but when the name Ulfberht is cross-referenced with local records, something stirs. There's mention of an Abbot Ulbertus, an educated man with influence in both the church and the military. Some think he may be the source. Not a blacksmith, but a sponsor. A patron saint of steel. Did Abbot Ulbertus fund the forging of these swords, or oversee a workshop hidden within monastery walls? Did he approve of his name becoming legend? Or would he have been horrified? Historians still debate whether Ulfberht was this man or someone else entirely. But the idea of a holy man birthing a warrior's weapon, it's oddly poetic. By now, you're probably starting to feel what the archaeologists did when they found the first Ulfberht: curiosity, admiration, and unease, because something this advanced, this precise, shouldn't be here. And yet, it is. So we follow the blade forward, one letter at a time, from forge to fire, from name to myth. In the next part, we'll see how modern science shattered assumptions and how a single sword, once wielded in silence, now demands to be heard. It rests under the microscope like a sleeping dragon, its edges dull with age, but its core still sharp. The scientists lean in, cautious, as if the sword might blink. Then the scan begins. A beam of X-rays moves slowly along the ancient metal. The screen flickers, then reveals something no one expected. The carbon content is off the charts. Not by mistake, not by contamination, but by design. What they're looking at is something called crucible steel, the purest form of steel known at the time. But that time, the 9th century. Europe wasn't supposed to have that kind of metallurgy until centuries later. And yet here it is, staring back at them, 1,000 years ahead of schedule. Ulfberht wasn't just strong. It was impossible. To make steel that pure, the iron must be heated beyond 1,500 degrees Celsius and kept in a sealed crucible, an airtight container, so that it can melt and mix evenly with carbon. That alone is tricky. But to control the carbon content with such precision, that's blacksmith sorcery. Most Viking swords of the period were pattern welded, layered like flaky pastry, twisting soft iron with harder carbon steel. Pretty to look at, yes, functional, kind of, but compared to an Ulfberht, like comparing a wooden club to a modern katana. Tests confirm it again and again. The Ulfberht steel contains almost zero slag, those tiny flecks of non-metallic waste that weaken a blade. Instead, the sword's structure is consistent all the way through. No flaws, no cracks. Just clean, controlled, high-carbon steel. Lab technician, amused, mutters, "We should be reverse engineering this for aerospace." And he's not wrong, but the sword holds more secrets. Under magnification, they find carbide's tiny crystals that only form under extreme heat and slow cooling. These carbides reinforce the blade like microscopic rebar, adding both flexibility and resilience. 1,000 years later, and the sword still passes strength tests that many modern replicas failed. It's like finding a smartphone inside A Roman helmet. This leads to a stunning realization. The creators of Ulfberht weren't guessing. They knew exactly what they were doing. Someone, somewhere, had access to the knowledge, tools, and temperatures to manufacture steel with qualities Europe wouldn't see again until the Industrial Revolution. That raises another unsettling possibility. Was this technology lost and rediscovered, or deliberately hidden? Historians still debate whether crucible steel traveled westward through trade, migration, or stolen knowledge. Some point to India's legendary wootz steel, famous for its shimmering patterns and sharpness, used in Damascus. Blades. Others believe it came through Persia, via Muslim traders or captured blacksmiths. The Vikings, through their extensive river networks, had access to the Volga trade route, reaching deep into Eastern Europe and touching the fringes of the Islamic world. It's not impossible that some bright-eyed Norse merchant saw a blade, bartered for it, and brought it back. But that doesn't explain how they replicated it. A one-off blade can be written off as imported. A series of blades with consistent metallurgy? That's a system. That's knowledge passed down. That's a forge with secrets. There's even a theory, yes, a wild one, that a group of Middle Eastern blacksmiths were captured or convinced to work under the protection of Frankish nobles, forging crucible steel in secret. No records exist. Of course, but then again, secrets leave shadows, not signatures. Oddly enough, this mystery takes us to a sleepy village in present-day Iran. In a half-buried workshop, archaeologists found fragments of steel bars with similar chemical properties to the Ulfberht blades. Tools nearby suggest crucible work. And dating? Around the 8th or 9th century. Right on time, but here's where things get uncomfortable. The metal fingerprints of some Ulfberhts match the trace elements of Middle Eastern or not European. Meaning, the materials, not just the method, may have come from afar. That doesn't just challenge Viking history. It pokes a stick into the hornet's nest of European technological pride. Modern metallurgists call the Ulfberht a hyper-artifact, an item so advanced for its time that it breaks the expected trajectory of innovation. Like finding a light bulb in a medieval castle. It shouldn't exist. But it does, and yet, even with all this science, one question lingers. Why go to all this trouble? Why make something so perfect in a world of good enough? The answer might be cultural, spiritual, even superstitious. In Viking society, swords weren't just tools. They were companions, namesakes, and sometimes sacred. A good sword could outlive its owner, be passed down, whispered about, even buried like a treasure. Some were believed to carry the spirit of the warrior. Others were named like living beings: leg-biter, skull-splitter, gore-dancer. Owning a true Ulfberht might have meant more than having the sharpest blade. It could have symbolized divine favor. The gods themselves might have blessed the iron. Of course, that didn't stop some warriors from trying their luck with the fakes. Imagine the battlefield. Two swords clash in the fog. One shatters like glass. The other slices through the air. Humming like a bowstring, one fighter stands. The other bleeds into the frost. Now picture the moment before battle. A young Viking runs his fingers along the inscription, plus ULFBERHT plus. Is it real? He doesn't know. He just hopes. And sometimes, hope is enough. Here's a fun thought. What if the swords were never meant for mass combat at all? What if they were ceremonial? diplomatic gifts, a sign of alliance between North and South, pagan and Christian. There's a tale in an old Norse saga about a king who carried a blade forged by fire and faith and gifted it to a Saxon lord as a token of peace. The story isn't dated, but the sword's description sounds oddly familiar. The kind of poetic touch you find in myth or marketing. Because let's not forget, every name etched into a blade is also a promise. And promises, as history shows, have a way of being broken or counterfeited. Still, the Ulfberht doesn't break. It bends. It holds. It waits. And in the next part of our journey, this impossible sword leads us into the mountains of legend toward the forge that shouldn't exist and the hands that may have shaped the future. Wind coils through the pine trees. Snow crunches underfoot. Somewhere high in the Scandinavian mountains, legend says there was a forge that burned hotter than any other. A place where iron whispered and fire obeyed. No map marks it. No ruins remain. But the stories have never stopped. They call it the Ghost Forge. No one agrees where it was. Some say the far reaches of Norway. Others believe the Black Forest in modern-day Germany. But all the old tales describe the same things. A roaring fire heard for miles, a glow like dawn seen at midnight, and a man, sometimes a monk, sometimes a smith who never aged and never spoke. Of course, to modern ears, it sounds like folklore. But when the Ulfberht blade started turning up near those same areas, often in places not known for battle, but for pilgrimage, historians took a second look. One blade found near the village of Reichenau, for instance, was buried beneath the remains of what once was a Benedictine monastery. The soil revealed traces of coal ash far richer in carbon than typical wood-burning sites of the era, suggesting metallurgical work that required intense, sustained heat. Too intense for normal forges. A coincidence? Maybe, but it aligns with the mystery. Ulfberht swords seem to form a crescent on the map, stretching from western Germany through the Alps, curving northward into Denmark and coastal Sweden, always near rivers, always near trade routes, but never near large cities. It's almost as if whoever made them wanted to stay hidden. One scholar, halfway serious, called it a mobile forge. The idea? A traveling workshop, packed on carts, moving from monastery to monastery under the protection of the church or a noble house. Implausible, but not impossible. And while we're on strange ideas, here's a fun one. What if the Ghost Forge didn't exist above ground at all? In 2014, spelunkers in Austria discovered an abandoned tunnel network near an old iron mine. Deep inside, they found remains of a small chamber blackened with soot. Along the walls, tiny slag inclusions, just a few grams, matched the metallurgical signature of high-carbon steel. No documentation, no village nearby. Just a hole in the earth and an echo of fire. Was it a one-time experiment? A secret forge? A failed attempt to copy the Ulfberht? No one knows, but the whispers persist. Some locals still tell of a blade buried somewhere nearby, marked with the name, but never found. Passed down in stories about glowing rivers and forges that sing. Odd, isn't it? How many of these blades appear in unlikely places? Not where great battles were fought, but in peaceful graves, farmlands, even under collapsed chapels. It's as if the sword itself was revered not just as a weapon, but as a kind of holy object. One story from Swedish folklore tells of a woman who found a blade in the forest. She didn't dare touch it. She covered it with moss, left a gift of berries beside it, and whispered a prayer to Odin. The story says her crops flourished that year, and wolves never returned to her land. Superstition? Likely. But superstition doesn't travel alone, it rides with history, often in the passenger seat. And that brings us to an uncomfortable truth. We may never find the real forge, not because it didn't exist, but because it was meant to disappear. You see, the 10th century was a time of transition. Viking raids began to fade. Christianity spread northward. And with that came new rules, new powers, and the slow erasure of old knowledge. A sword like Ulfberht, too strong, too foreign, too steeped in legend, may have threatened the very order trying to rise. Better to bury the technique, burn the notes. Let time turn flame to fog. Historians still debate whether the disappearance of Ulfberht was due to politics, war, or simply the death of its last true smith. Some argue the knowledge was never lost, just hidden behind the church's locked doors. Others believe it was passed quietly, through symbols, small hammers carved into chapel walls, or patterns woven into bishop robes. You laugh. But think about it. How many secrets have survived because they weren't written down? And still, in the middle of this mystery, there are artifacts that just don't fit. A blade found in Denmark has a hilt with Christian crosses, but runes scratched beneath the grip. Another, found in Poland, was wrapped in silk, not local wool. Some blades are buried upright. Others bent in half, a ritual act of sword killing meant to release its spirit. The symbols conflict, the customs vary, but the name remains. Even the worst preserved blades, rusted to shadows, carry that word, Ulfberht, sometimes neat, sometimes sloppy, but always there, always insisting. Now here's something funny. In one museum in Berlin, there's a display that includes 2 Ulfberht swords, one real, one fake. They're placed side by side in the glass case, but the plaque doesn't say which is which. The guide shrugs and smiles. That's part of the exhibit. Visitors argue. They inspect the hilts, count the letters, measure the curves. But in the end, they leave uncertain. Maybe that's the point, because Ulfberht isn't just a sword anymore. It's a symbol of uncertainty. A relic that reminds us how little we know about the past and how easily one name, etched in iron, can outlive empires. And in the next part of our tale, that name leads us down an even stranger path. One that begins not with a smith, but with a monk crossing a forbidden border with fire in his satchel and secrets on his tongue. The monk was traveling alone. His robes were muddy. His hands trembled from cold, or maybe from what he carried. Inside a tightly wrapped bundle, hidden beneath dried figs and scraps of parchment, was a fragment of metal, small, dark, deceptively plain, but it wasn't what it looked like. It was knowledge in solid form. A shard of the East, a whisper of fire. He was not supposed to be here. The year is 831. A Charlemagne's dead. His empire, fractured among his heirs, grows tense and territorial. The church is rising in power, setting rules that reach beyond scripture. One of those rules? No export of advanced tools or weapon-making materials, especially not to the north. Especially not to the Pagans. And yet, there are records faint, disputed, and frustrating that suggest something slipped through. That a few monks, sympathetic or greedy, or maybe just curious, began trading more than prayers. One name appears more than once in this trail of parchment: Brother Odo of Fulda. Historians still debate whether Brother Odo ever truly existed, or whether he was a convenient ghost stitched together from a dozen different monks. But fragments from the Fulda monastery hint at a traveler who made frequent journeys to the eastern markets, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, always under religious pretext, always returning with strange goods. In one ledger, now faded and almost illegible, an entry reads, Ferium nigrum ex Orient, black iron from the east. The timing is too perfect to ignore. That same year, the earliest Ulfberht blade confirmed authentic appears in the region not far from Fulda, and suddenly a new theory emerges. The monks didn't forge the blades, but they delivered the recipe. Picture it: a quiet chapel by day, with chants echoing through the halls. But in the cellar, at night, behind a wall that smells faintly of pitch and oil, someone is hammering. Not iron horseshoes or cooking knives, something finer, something more dangerous. It's a romantic image, sure, but the pieces fit too well. A group of monks, disillusioned with empire, smuggling steel knowledge northward, some for profit, others for ideals, teaching a handful of Frankish or Norse blacksmiths how to raise their furnaces hotter, to mix their ores better, to cast metal that sings. And what did they get in return? Gold? Protection? Access to forbidden lands? Maybe. Or maybe they just wanted to see what would happen when the North had fire. In a monastery letter written decades later, there's a strange passage that has puzzled scholars. He who taught the pagans to temper fire shall see his name carried in battle. Many dismiss it as metaphor. Others believe it's a veiled reference to Ulfberht, either the man, the monk, or the message. But while the monks may have carried the knowledge, they weren't the only players in this quiet game. Traders from the Chiles, from the Pindus, East Byzantines, Persians, and Arab merchants also left traces in northern Europe. One shipwreck off the coast of modern-day Latvia revealed coins from Baghdad, fabrics from Samarkand, and iron bars. These bars match almost exactly the composition of the metal used in several authentic Ulfberhts: high in carbon, low in impurities, with trace elements found only in ore mine near what is now Uzbekistan. You have to pause here and let that sink in. A sword made by Vikings, etched with a Frankish name, forged with steel from Central Asia. All in the 9th century. That's not a trade network. That's a web of mystery. And just when it seems the lines can't tangle more, enter the middlemen, the Norse traders themselves. While popular culture paints Vikings as axe-wielding brutes, they were also savvy merchants. Some of their largest settlements, like Hidibi and Burka, were trading hubs buzzing with goods from east and west. Hidibi. Archaeologists found a smithy filled with crucibles and tongs designed for high-temperature work. Most of the tools were broken, melted, or warped, signs of dangerous experimentation. One scrap of metal pulled from the forge debris tested close to crucible steel. It's not proof, but it's a smoky trail leading deeper into the fire. Maybe one smith cracked the formula, then taught a few others. Maybe that knowledge was guarded, taught only to sons, apprentices sworn to silence. Maybe it became ritual, because here's the odd thing: authentic Ulfberhts suddenly vanish around the year 1000. Not fade, not decline, vanish. After nearly 2 centuries of quiet production, the real swords stop appearing. Only the imitations remain, poorly made, sloppy, a parody of what once was, what happened. Some point to the Christianization of the North. As the old gods fell and churches rose, pagan traditions, including weapon worship, were stamped out. Smiths who once worked under the veil of twilight may have been absorbed into monasteries. Or worse, eliminated. Others suggest political reasons. The trade routes collapsed. The supply lines dried up. The monks stopped traveling. Or maybe the last person who really knew how to make Ulfberht steel died and took the secret with him. In any case, the silence is deafening. It's as if the world turned a page and a legend slipped between the lines. And yet, in every Ulfberht blade that survives, you can still feel it, the tension of time, the mystery of metal, the quiet voice of someone who once knew exactly what they were doing. In the next chapter, that voice will echo across a cold sea. A Viking ship, broken by storms, will reveal a cargo that should never have been there, setting off a new trail that leads us further from certainty and closer to awe. The wreck was a surprise. They were looking for amber, not iron. But storms have a way of unearthing secrets. The sea doesn't forget, it just waits, off the coast of the Black Sea. Near the mouth of the Dniester River, archaeologists uncovered the shattered hull of a long-forgotten Viking ship. A Nair, they said, wide-bellied, made for trade, not war. The wood had rotted, but its cargo had not. Among the usual goods, furs, beads, wax was something extraordinary. 3 swords, tightly wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath clay jars. Not Norse in appearance. These weren't rugged, iron-forged axes or simple blades. They were elegant, purposeful, and each bore the same mark. Plus ULFBERHT plus. All 3. Now, this was strange for several reasons. First, the location. The Black Sea wasn't common Viking territory. But the more historians looked, the more they found that Norse traders had indeed traveled that far down the Volga and Dnieper rivers, across vast lake systems, and deep into Slavic and Byzantine lands. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were dealing. Second, the preservation. Despite centuries underwater, the blades were in exceptional condition. One, when tested, still held its edge. Another rang with an eerie resonance when tapped. Modern metallurgists said it shouldn't be possible. But by now, Ulfberht had stopped caring about should be. Third, and perhaps most telling, the steel composition. These swords weren't fakes, they were real. High-carbon crucible steel, impossibly pure. As good or better than others found in Western Europe. And here's the twist. The swords found on that ship were older than some of the Ulfberhts previously catalogued, which meant the trail didn't end in the east. It may have begun there. Historians still debate whether the Ulfberht swords originated in the Frankish lands and spread outward, or if some early versions were made in secret by traveling smiths, following Eastern methods. But now, with these blades, the idea of a purely Western invention began to crack. These weren't just swords on a ship. They were proof of a network that stretched across half the known world through rivers, markets, monasteries, and battlefields. Imagine the scene. A Viking merchant stands on the deck, wind biting at his skin, eyes scanning the coast. His cargo is valuable, too valuable to flaunt. The Ulfberths are wrapped and buried beneath barrels of honey and wine like contraband. Maybe he knows what they are. Maybe he doesn't, but he knows they matter. He's not alone. Down below, tucked in crates, are Byzantine coins, silk from China, and glass from the Middle East. The world, in his hold, compressed into trade. And now, all of it lies under the sea. When the news broke, it triggered a fresh wave of speculation. Who were these sailors? Who forged the blades? Who paid for them? Were they intended for battle or for someone's private collection? Were they part of a diplomatic exchange, a bribe, perhaps? There's no answer. Just possibilities. One scholar floated a theory that turned heads, that the Ulfberht swords were never meant for war on a large scale. They were prototypes, experimental, a project funded by a small elite group, religious, noble, or otherwise, meant to test the limits of metallurgy and myth. An Iron Age think tank. Sounds wild. But when you hold one of these swords, when you see how far it traveled, how precisely it was made, it's hard to rule anything out. And let's not forget the oddest find from that shipwreck. Alongside the swords was a small tablet of wax, sealed in a leather pouch. Time had warped it, of course, but under the microscope, impressions remained symbols, perhaps a merchant's mark. No one has translated them yet, but some think it could be a receipt, a record, a final breadcrumb. If true, it would be the first known piece of written documentation directly connected to an Ulfberht sword. One that might finally tell us who was behind the name, or maybe not. Maybe the wax tablet will crumble into dust the moment someone touches it. That's the thing about this story, it pulls you forward. But the closer you get, the less certain everything becomes. The Ulfberht blades don't answer questions. They multiply them, and yet, for all the uncertainty, the fact remains, these swords were found in the Black Sea, far from any Frankish forge, further still from Scandinavia. And that tells us one thing for sure. Someone wanted them there. Maybe to sell, maybe to gift, maybe to hide. Because here's the irony. While the world argued about borders and gods and kings, a blade was moving quietly across continents, connecting them, outlasting them. And just for a moment, you can almost believe that the blade mattered more than the hand that held it. One last detail, easily missed, the way the swords were placed, not loose, not tossed. Arranged, carefully, lovingly, as if someone knew they might be found one day, and wanted them to be ready. In the next part of our journey, we dive deeper into the name itself, Ulfberht, and discover how it became both a badge of honor and a clever deception, as fakes flooded the battlefield and truth bent beneath steel. The name glints in the firelight, plus ULFBERHT plus. 7 letters and 2 crosses. But what do they mean? Who was Ulfberht? A man? A family? A monastery's code word? That's where the confusion deepens, because not every Ulfberht sword is the same. Some are pristine, made of the finest crucible steel. Others are sloppy, riddled with slag, etched with trembling hands. One sword bears the name plus ULFBER, another plus ULFBERHTT plus. The differences are subtle, but they speak volumes. It's like looking at medieval knockoffs. Historians still debate whether these were deliberate fakes, made to deceive, or if they were simply lower-tier versions made for less wealthy warriors. Either way, the effect was the same. Ulfberht became a brand, a promise, And eventually, a problem. The earliest blades crafted with care, likely by a small group of master smiths, were almost mythical in quality. Their performance in battle was legendary. They didn't just hold an edge, they kept it. They didn't shatter in the cold or warp in the heat. They bent and then bounced back. And they killed. Word spread. And with fame came forgery. You can imagine the scene. A blacksmith in Denmark, tired of being overlooked, hears of the great swords from the south. He's never seen one, but he knows the name. So he heats up his forge, hammers out a blade the old-fashioned way, good, but not extraordinary, and carves the letters into the metal, a little crooked, maybe a letter's missing. But to the untrained eye, it's close enough. The sword sells. Others follow suit. Soon, the name Ulfberht is on every battlefield from Norway to Normandy, some real, some not. Warriors begin to wonder, is it better to carry a true blade no one knows, or a false one that sounds like legend? That question doesn't go away. Not then. Not now. And here's the twist. Even the fakes could be dangerous. In the right hands, even an inferior blade can win a fight, especially if it scares your enemy before the first swing. By the mid-10th century, the market is flooded. More than 170 swords bearing the Ulfberht name have been found across Europe, more than the average smithy could have possibly produced, even over generations. So what happened? Some believe the original Ulfberht workshop, if it ever existed, was overwhelmed by demand. That apprentices took up the work, or rival smiths tried to capitalize on the trend. The name spread like wildfire, and the meaning diluted. Others argue something darker, that the church, having initially helped protect or fund the forges, allowed the knowledge to slip either by intent or indifference. If too many had the secret, it was no longer power. It was noise. That brings us back to the strange detail found in many imitation swords. The errors, spelling mistakes, off-center letters, missing crosses. Sometimes they seem like accidents. Other times they feel deliberate, as if the forgers were trying to say, we're not the original, but we're close. A little like those market stall Gucci bags, right? The one spelled Goosey. Now picture a Viking warlord squinting at his new sword. He's paid a chest of silver for it. The letters don't quite look right. But who's going to argue? Not the poor smith, not the men beside him, and certainly not the enemies who will see the sword gleaming in the sun and think Ulfberht because the name had power. Even when the metal didn single quotes T.1 recorded battle in East Francia tells of a commander ordering his men to aim for the less shiny swords, the ones he assumed were fakes, but he was wrong. The shiny ones were ceremonial, cheap in build, but polished for show. The real Ulfberht's dark, unassuming, cut his line in half. There's irony in that, but it also reveals how myth warps reality. Ulfberht stopped being a sword. It became an idea, a symbol of excellence, whether deserved or not. And still, the question echoes, who was the first? A man named Ulfberht is mentioned in several Carolingian charters from the 9th century. He was a nobleman, a patron of churches, perhaps even an abbot. But nowhere does it say he forged steel. Some argue he didn't have to. Perhaps he funded the project. Perhaps he inspired the name. Perhaps he simply allowed the monks under his charge to pursue forbidden knowledge. Think of it like this. A wealthy patron sponsors a genius inventor. The inventor makes something incredible. But the name that survives is the sponsor's. That's not new. That's history. One theory holds that the original Ulfberht was never meant to be public, that the name stamped onto the swords was a kind of code identifying the source to allies and confusing enemies. The two crosses, one before, one after, might have marked approval, a sign of authenticity. Or perhaps they were protective sigils, invoking divine power over a weapon designed to kill. It's possible. After all, even devout Christian warriors needed swords. And if you're going to carry steel into battle, better it be steel that God approves of. Or so they hoped, but not everyone agreed. Some Christian scribes denounced the Ulfberht blades as cursed tools of pride and pagan sorcery. One German bishop wrote that no man may carry the sword of vanity and remain in grace. He likely meant the fakes, but the line blurred quickly, and in the next part of this story, we'll follow that blur into a time when belief mattered more than facts. When warriors died for names they didn't understand, and when one sword, found at the bottom of a well, would reignite the legend that refused to be buried. The sword was buried deep, not in a battlefield grave, not in a royal tomb, but at the bottom of a village well. The story begins in 2002, in a quiet German town near the Rhine. A group of construction workers, restoring a medieval courtyard, struck something hard beneath the surface. At first, they thought it was scrap metal. Then, the blade emerged, long, narrow, etched plus Ulfberht plus perfectly spelled, both crosses intact. The real thing. It had been preserved in near total darkness, surrounded by cold water and clay. No rust, no fractures, just silence for nearly 1,000 years. And the question, of course, why was it there? Historians still debate whether the sword was hidden or discarded. One theory suggests it was thrown into the well during a time of invasion, concealed for safety, then forgotten. Another, more poetic, says the sword was sacrificed. You see, wells were once sacred places. Long before Christianity, they were believed to be portals to the gods. Offerings were tossed in, coins, jewelry, even weapons to appease unseen forces. When the faith changed, the practice didn't die. It simply shifted. Old rituals wore new clothes. That blade resting in the well may have been part of that blend, half Christian relic, half pagan prayer, but its discovery triggered more than curiosity. It sparked something deeper, a rush to reevaluate everything. We thought we knew about Ulfberht, because this sword wasn't found in a grand city or famous monastery. It was in a village, a forgotten corner of the empire. And yet, its steel was flawless, its craftsmanship unmistakable. It matched the best of any blade held in museum collections. And that forced a new idea into the light. The Ulfberht forges may not have been in one place, but many. That is, instead of a single workshop guarded by monks or nobles, perhaps there was a network, loose collection of smiths, trained in the method, sworn to secrecy, spread across the continent. Each would have their own apprentice, their own crucibles, their own role in keeping the mystery alive. A kind of medieval secret society, not of priests or assassins, but of blacksmiths. It's not as crazy as it sounds. Throughout history, there are scattered references to groups of craftsmen who guarded their trade secrets fiercely, the glassmakers of Venice, the Damascus steel smiths, the guilds of Florence. The tools changed, but the patterns DIDN single quote state dot knowledge was power. And power, back then, could get you burned dot, so the forges hid in plain sight inside monasteries, near rivers, behind shrines. A prayer in the chapel, a fire in the cellar. No one asked questions. Even the inscriptions may have served as a kind of coded language. A properly marked Ulfberht blade wasn't just a symbol of strength, it was a sign that you were in. That you belonged to something bigger than yourself. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe the blades were stamped to protect the maker, like a signature. This is mine. Copy it, and you answer to me. Because by the time the well sword was made late, 10th century, the market was flooded with counterfeits. Dozens of blades bearing misspelled names, crooked crosses, cheap steel. Some so poorly made they snapped with a single swing, and yet people still bought them, because the name still meant something. There's a moment in one chronicle, a faded diary from a Frankish soldier where he describes the fear before battle. He writes, "The enemy bore steel with the mark. We prayed not to meet it edge to edge." He doesn't mention kings. He doesn't mention gods. Just the mark. That's branding, 1,000 years before marketing departments. And the irony? Most people holding an Ulfberht sword real or fake had no idea what it truly was. They didn't understand crucible steel, carbon content, or metallurgical purity. They just knew the sword didn't break. And that was enough. But here's where the well sword gets stranger. Further analysis revealed microscopic grooves in the blade too uniform to be random. Some believe they're remnants of a sharpening technique. Others think they might be symbols, worn away with time. But one fragment remains a shallow spiral just above the hilt dot. It doesn't match any known rune. But it does resemble a symbol found on a relic in a Persian armory dated 2 centuries earlier. Coincidence? Maybe. But with Ulfberht, coincidence becomes pattern faster than anyone likes to admit. Now imagine the man who owned that sword. Maybe a soldier, maybe a noble. He kept it hidden. Maybe because he knew it was real, and that made it dangerous. Or maybe because he feared it. Because it came from a world beyond maps, forged with hands not his own, made of fire too hot for any village hearth. Eventually, he died. The sword was thrown into the well out of reach, out of sight, out of time. Until it WSN single quotes D. And now it sits in a museum. Glass walls, soft lights. Visitors stare and whisper. Some take pictures. Some just stand and wonder. The sword says nothing. It doesn't have to dot in the next part of this journey. We follow a different kind of trail, not one of battlefields or monasteries, but of forgeries so clever, even the experts were fooled. And one sword, hidden in a private collection for decades, that nearly rewrote the legend again. The sword arrived in a velvet-lined box, hand-delivered to a German museum by a well-dressed man who claimed his grandfather had owned it since the 1920s. It had passed through 3 generations, displayed over fireplaces, admired by dinner guests, polished every winter. A family heirloom, he said. Nothing more. But when the curators opened the box, they stopped breathing. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. The lines were clean. The steel shimmered under the light. The inscription? Plus Ulfberht, plus flawless. Not just well done, but precise in a way no known example had ever been. The letters were uniform, the crosses equidistant, the edges sharper than anything pulled from the earth. It looked perfect, and that was the problem. Because real Ulfberths, even the best of them, bear the marks of handwork, tiny inconsistencies in carving, faint ripples in steel, wear from age. This sword had none. It was immaculate, pristine, suspicious. The museum ran tests. First, a visual comparison to confirmed blades. Too sharp, too smooth. Then, X-rays. The grain of the metal was tight and symmetrical, exactly what modern metallurgy could produce. But not a 9th century forge. Finally, the kicker, carbon dating. The sword wasn't forged in the Viking Age. It was made sometime between 1915 and 1930. A fake. But not just any fake. This was a masterpiece. Historians still debate whether it was meant to deceive. Some believe it was a passion project, an early 20th century blacksmith, fascinated by Norse legend, attempting to recreate the ultimate blade. Others think it was built for a darker purpose, to sell, to pass as real, to make someone rich, whatever. The reason it worked until it didn't. The discovery shook collectors around the world. If a fake this good could hide in plain sight for nearly a century, how many others had gone undetected? Museums quietly began retesting their Ulfberths. Some passed, others didn't. Single quotes T. One particularly embarrassing case involved a private auction. In Switzerland, where a buyer paid the equivalent of $700,000 for what he thought was a rare, intact Ulfberht blade. The sword was authenticated, certified, and celebrated. Until 6 months later, when a student noticed something odd during a visit. The plus symbols were too modern machine-cut, with a symmetry only possible with industrial tools. Further tests revealed the steel came from recycled railroad tracks. After that, the term Frankenbert began circulating among experts, a nickname for fakes made from mismatched parts or modern materials. Some were obvious, others were frighteningly clever, and that's where things get philosophical. If a sword bears the name Ulfberht, is it still an Ulfberht, even if it's fake? The academic community split. Some said yes. If the blade reflects the legend, if it captures the spirit, the style, the skill, then it's part of the story. Others insisted authenticity matters, that a sword not forged in the fire of its time is just a ghost in armor. And then there's the third camp, the quiet ones, the ones who say, what if the fakes are the story? Think about it. For over 200 years, blacksmiths across Europe tried to imitate the Ulfberht blades, not just for profit, but for pride, to prove they could. Some did it poorly. Others came close, but all of them added to the myth. They built the mystery, piece by piece. In a way, every forgery is a love letter, a tribute to a blade so perfect, people couldn't let it go even when they couldn't match it. There's an odd charm to that. One modern blacksmith, interviewed for a documentary, put it like this: you don't fake something unless it means something. He's right. Every fake sword bears the weight of belief. Someone believed enough to make it. Someone else believed enough to buy it. And someone, someday, will believe in it all over again. Of course, not all forgeries were created. One, found in a noble's estate in Hungary, was made with pig iron. It bent like a coat hanger. The inscription, spelled backward, Threbflu, plus another from a rural Polish collection. had been acid-etched with a Dremel tool sparkling under black light dot, but the best forgeries like the museum fake blur the line between deception and dedication. And this raises a final, unsettling thought. If a fake can fool even the experts, how many of the real Ulfberhts are actually fake? Historians still debate that too. Some push for stricter testing. Others accept a little ambiguity. And a few, the romantic ones, say it doesn't matter, because maybe Ulfberht was never about one blade. Maybe it was about an idea, a pursuit of something better, stronger, more enduring than anything before. And that idea lived on, long after the original forges went cold. In the next part of our tale, we step away from swords entirely into the quiet halls of a forgotten monastery, where a strange set of carvings might point to the true origin of the mark, and the monk who may have started it all. The monastery sits on a hill that no one visits. No road leads to it. The walls crumble with ivy. The bells haven't rung in centuries, but the carvings are still watching, tucked into the forests of Alsace, near the old borderlands. Between France and the Holy Roman Empire lies a nearly forgotten ruin known locally as the Silent Cloister. It doesn't appear in most guidebooks. Even regional maps skip over it. But for those who look, it's there, quiet, patient, and filled with secrets. And one of those secrets may just be the origin of Ulfberht. The story starts with a French archaeologist named Leon Marchand. In 1997, while surveying the region's old Roman roads, he stumbled upon the cloister's remains. A half-collapsed chapel, a library turned to moss, and most importantly, a series of cryptic engravings beneath the altar. The symbols were faint but deliberate. A sword, a flame, a cross, and 7 letters deeply carved. Ulfberht, but this wasn't a sword. It wasn't even a weapon. It was a signature, and beside it, something stranger still. A circular emblem with 3 concentric rings each, one etched with unfamiliar script. Scholars couldn't translate it. Some said it resembled early Persian characters. Others thought it echoed Coptic code. But no consensus emerged. What did emerge was a pattern. The same emblem appears in 2 other places, once in a burned manuscript found in Milan, and once on a cracked chalice discovered in a crypt in Aachen, all 3 linked to religious orders, all 3 bearing faint whispers of metallurgy. And that raised the question no one had dared to ask out loud: was Ulfberht a monastic order? It sounds impossible. But look closer. The Silent Cloister, according to local oral history, wasn't just a place of prayer. It was a place of work, a workshop. Records found later described holy fire beneath the stone and iron trials in the cellar. Most dismissed these as metaphor, but when ground-penetrating radar scanned the floor beneath the chapel, they found something shocking: a forge, not just a hearth, but a full metallurgical space complete with channels for airflow, stone crucibles, and the remnants of bellows built for high heat processing. This wasn't cooking. This was craft. And then came the carvings. One column bore a Latin inscription, worn but legible: in ferrum lux, in lux veritas, in iron light, in light truth. A motto? Some think so. Others think it was part of a rite, a ritual, perhaps, for initiates, because nearby, etched into a loose floor tile, was a date, 843 AD, and below it, a name one known only to this site, Brother Theuderic. No records place him at any known monastery. No letters survive, but the inscription below his name reads, Custodian of the Forge. It's not proof, but it's close. One theory, still controversial, proposes that Ulfberht wasn't a single man, but a title, a name passed down between forge masters, of a hidden Christian order dedicated to advancing steelcraft in Europe. Not for war, not for kings, but for balance. Sound ridiculous? So did the idea of monks being early metallurgists until we found bellows in cloisters, or monks traveling with Eastern traders until we found Arab coins in abbey basements, or monks forging supersteel until we saw the name carved beneath an altar. And here's something even odder. The forge beneath the silent cloister had no anvil. Instead, there was a stone slab carved with grooves, stained black, set in the center of the floor, like an altar itself. Tools surrounded it, but none were typical. Thin hammers, wire scrapers, even a mold for engraving. This wasn't just a forge. It was a studio, a place where precision mattered more than force, where every inch of steel was watched, cared for, prayed over. That aligns with the legend. Ulfberht swords weren't mass-produced. They were intimate, few, intentional, and perhaps, if the cloister theory is correct, sacred. One academic suggested that each sword was made with a blessing, not the kind mumbled before meals, but a ritual involving scripture, silence, and the presence of 3 monks. The Trinity of Iron, they called it. Symbolic, ceremonial, quietly terrifying. But then, why did it end? Why did these blades vanish around the year 1000? Their secrets scattered. Some blame the fall of the cloister. Scorch marks on the chapel wall suggest a fire intense, fast, and fatal. Bones in the crypt show signs of sudden trauma. Smashed skulls, burned ribs. Something came, or someone, and the forge went dark. After that, no more inscriptions, no more symbols. Just fakes, spreading across Europe like echoes. And what about the emblem? The 3 rings? A recent discovery in the British Museum might hold a clue. On the spine of a leather-bound prayer book dated to the late 800s, a small wax seal was found matching the same pattern. And within the text, a line few had noticed. Before, the circle holds the flame. The flame tempers the faithful. It's vague, frustrating, but strangely fitting. Maybe the emblem was a code. Maybe it marked those who knew. Or maybe it was a signature of sorrow etched by the last forge master before the cloister fell. We may never know, but the carvings remain, faint, patient, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And in the next part of our journey, we ask that question on a frozen battlefield where an Ulfberht sword turned the tide of war, and then vanished forever into legend. The snow came early that year, thick, wet, relentless. It smothered the fields, filled the riverbanks, and turned the road to mud. Horses slipped, men froze. And in the chaos, one battle changed the course of history because of a single blade. The year was 955 AD. The place, Lechfeld, near the banks of the river Lech in present-day Germany. The battle was supposed to be quick. The invading Magyar forces, a fierce nomadic group from the steppes, had crossed into East Francia, expecting little resistance. They had raided these lands before, fast and brutal. always retreating before local armies could respond. But this time, the Franks were ready. At the head of their army rode Otto, the first king of East Francia, later crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor. His men were fewer, but they were trained, disciplined, and among them, according to a near-contemporary chronicle, was a champion of the north, bearing a blade that glowed like frost. The chronicle doesn't name him, it only calls him Saxon, but the description of his sword is unmistakable, etched with crosses, so sharp it could split a spear shaft in the air, and curiously never dulled. Sound familiar? Historians still debate whether this reference truly describes an Ulfberht sword. Some say it's just poetic exaggeration. Others believe it's the only battlefield record of the weapon in action, written not by legend makers, but by monks who witnessed the event from afar, because what happened next was no metaphor. As the Magyars advanced, their horse archers loosed volley after volley. Otto's lines buckled, then reformed. At the center, the unnamed Saxon stepped forward. He fought without shield. His sword, light enough to wield one-handed, struck faster than his enemies could react. He moved like a dancer in snow, cutting through armor and fur, leaving chaos in his wake. At one point, the chronicle says, the sword hummed. Modern scientists laugh at that, but those who've tested real Ulfberhts under controlled conditions admit something eerie. When swung at the right angle, with enough force, the blade does make a sound. A low, vibrating tone like a bell rung from the edge of the world. Imagine hearing that in the middle of battle. Otto's men rallied. The invaders broke. The tide turned. By nightfall, the Franks had won. The Magyars were defeated, many captured or slain. It was the end of their incursions into the west and the beginning of a unified empire under Otto's crown. And the Saxon? He vanished. No record of his return. No name in the reward rolls. Just a single line in a monk's final note. The man with the blade of light disappeared into the storm. It could be metaphor or not. What is real is what they found 3 centuries later. In 1297, a local farmer digging near the river unearthed a sword long, narrow, and strangely preserved. The handle was gone, the hilt corroded, but the blade, perfect. On it, plus ULFBERHT plus, and beneath the letters, something never seen on any other known example: 3 concentric rings, etched so faintly they were almost missed, the same rings from the monastery. Suddenly, a new theory emerged. What if the blade from Lechfeld wasn't just an Ulfberht sword, but the last of its kind, forged at the silent cloister, carried by a monk-trained warrior, given to Otto himself or someone he trusted, as a divine weapon for a holy cause? It would explain the secrecy. It would explain the disappearance. And it would explain why no other Ulfberht sword found after the 10th century carries that ringed symbol again. Historians still argue. Some say the sword is a fake, planted later to stir local pride. Others claim it's real, but unrelated. But a quiet few believe it's the final link in a chain that stretched from eastern forges to northern battlefields to sacred cloisters. One sword, one legend, one turning point. And here's the odd part. After the Battle of Lechfeld, something changes. References to Ulfberht swords begin to decline. By the year 1000, they vanish from royal inventories. Blacksmiths stop using the name. Even the copies become fewer. It's as if the victory at Lechfeld marked not only the end of the Magyar threat, but the quiet retirement of the blade that helped end it, almost like it fulfilled its purpose. And then faded. But legends don't die so easily. Even centuries later, knights whispered of a sword of the saints, a weapon blessed by monks and lost to snow. One crusader wrote of hearing the hum of steel in a dream before battle. Another claimed his blade was haunted by a northern ghost. None of these tales hold up under scrutiny, but they don't have to, because once an object becomes myth, truth bends. And the Ulfberht blades, whether in fire or frost, always carried the power of belief. In the next part of this journey, we trace the afterlife of that belief, how the legend of Ulfberht shaped later ideas of craftsmanship, honor, and the forging of identities far beyond swords. Long after the swords themselves vanished from the forges, the name Ulfberht lived on not as steel, but as symbol. It slipped quietly out of the battlefield and into something subtler: storytelling, craftsmanship, even personal identity. And that, in a way, might be its greatest legacy. Let's begin in the 12th century. By then, the Ulfberht blades were no longer in use. Knights carried different weapons, broader, heavier, more suitable for armored combat. But in the poetry of the time, especially in the chansons, the jest, a particular type of sword began to appear: thin, sharp, etched with strange letters, blessed by monks, forged in fire that whispered. Sound familiar? These weren't literal descriptions of Ulfberht swords, but echoes. The concept of a blade so pure, so divine, so chosen, became the blueprint for the magical weapons of medieval romance. The sword of Roland, the blade of Charlemagne. Even Excalibur, though born in older myths, took on a metallic sheen suspiciously similar to the Ulfberht profile. Historians still debate whether these literary swords were directly inspired by Ulfberht's. Some argue it was coincidence. Others see deliberate parallels, particularly in the way these swords were not just weapons, but tests of worth. Only the righteous could wield them. Only the chosen could keep them. It's a motif that shows up again and again, not just in Europe, but across the world. And in a strange way, it mirrors what we know about the original Ulfberhts. They weren't for everyone. They had to be earned, or inherited, or stolen. They carried power, but also responsibility. Centuries later, that idea took root in the most unexpected place: the blacksmiths' guild. In parts of Germany and France. Even into the 17th century, certain smithing families traced their lineages real or imagined back to a legendary forge. They didn't name it outright, but their family symbols? Rings, crosses, blades. Some even referred to themselves as sons of the flame. Sound romantic? It was, but it was also business. To be part of that tradition meant your work mattered. Your steel had lineage. And your tools weren't just metal, they were memory. That ethos of craft as inheritance survives today in artisan culture. From knife makers in Zolingen to swordsmiths in Japan, there's a shared reverence for the idea of perfected steel, passed down, protected, improved, but never replaced. One modern swordsmith put it best in an interview: "When I make a blade, I imagine I'm whispering to every hand that's ever held one before me." That's Ulfberht, in spirit, if not in stamp. And then there's the stranger influence, one that slipped into language. In Old High German, the word Bert meant bright or shining. Over time, it became part of names: Berthold, Albert, Robert, all implying light or brilliance. Some linguists argue that Ulfberht contributed to this trend, that the blade's association with light real or metaphorical helped reinforce that root. It's speculative, of course, but not impossible, because language, like legend, absorbs what it touches. Even today, in Northern Europe, some small villages still whisper about ghost swords, buried in bogs, hidden in wells, shining under moonlight. Children dare each other to look for them. Elders warn them not to. The details change. The steel does not. And here's a curious, modern twist. In 2012, a boutique knife company in Iceland released a line of high-carbon chef's knives branded Ulfberht. Their tagline, forged with history, sharpened with purpose. Clever, but also telling, because even now, more than 1,000 years after the original forge went cold, the name still holds power, still sells, still stirs something deep. Why? Because it represents something rare. Excellence, yes, but also mystery. The idea that there was a time once when someone, somewhere, figured out how to make something better, not by chance, but on purpose. And no one since has matched it, not perfectly, even with modern tools and digital precision. Today's metallurgists still marvel at how the original Ulfberht blades were made. We can reproduce the materials. We can approximate the process. But there's always something missing. A resonance, a hum, a whisper in the hilt. One researcher, when asked what made the Ulfberht so special, simply said it knew what it wanted to be. That might be myth speaking, or it might be the quiet truth behind every great creation, because that's the final legacy of the Ulfberht name. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement, a line drawn in fire. And in the next part of our journey, we'll meet the people who are still chasing that line, modern scientists, smiths, and dreamers, each trying to unlock the last remaining secret, how exactly these swords were made, and why no one else could ever do it quite the same. The forge is electric now, the floor is concrete. The tools hum with precision, but the goal? It hasn't changed in 1,000 years. In a clean lab outside Dresden, Germany, a group of scientists in white coats lean over what looks like a weapon from myth. On a screen beside them, a microscope zooms in on steel, its surface alive with patterns too small for the eye to see. This is where the past meets the present. The modern attempt to remake Ulfberht. It began in earnest in the early 2000s, when a team of metallurgists decided to reverse engineer one of the most intact Ulfberht swords ever found. Their mission wasn't just academic. They wanted to understand deeply exactly how something so advanced could have existed in the 9th century. They started by slicing off a tiny sample from a broken corner, a sliver of history. Under the electron microscope, the results were shocking. The steel was crucible quality, meaning it had been melted down completely and reformed, something that required temperatures over 1,400 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than most medieval forges could reach. The carbon content was near perfect. The impurities were minimal. The grain structure, uniform. And yet, there were no signs of modern production, no machine marks, no artificial polishing, no inconsistencies in alignment. Just pure, impossibly consistent steel. The scientists were stunned. One whispered, "We're not supposed to see this kind of quality until the Industrial Revolution." So how did they do it? Historians still debate whether the Vikings or their continental cousins had access to special techniques lost to time. Some think the knowledge came from the East, brought by traders returning along the Volga and Silk roads. Others suspect the monks, again, working in quiet cellars with strange books and hotter-than-usual furnaces. But in 2013, a breakthrough. A German smith named Helmut Fuchs, after years of trial and error, successfully forged a blade using only tools and methods available in the 9th century. His secret? Not coal, not magic, but glass. By adding powdered glass to the molten iron during smelting, he created a kind of liquid seal trapping out oxygen, preventing impurities and allowing higher carbon content. This method, long suspected but never confirmed, mirrored the crucible technique used in ancient Persia. Suddenly, the mystery narrowed. The knowledge wasn't missing. It was forgotten. Fuchs' blade wasn't a perfect Ulfberht replica, but it came close. When tested, it matched several key properties of original finds: hardness, edge retention, and flexibility. And when etched with acid, it revealed a pattern known as bainite, a sign of steel cooled just right. His sword didn't hum, but it sang. News spread. Other smiths joined the challenge. A forge in Norway replicated the process using bog iron and bellows. A metallurgist in Canada tried using sand instead of glass. A Swedish team added pine resin to adjust the carbon flow, all of them chasing a whisper. And yet, no one's made a perfect match. That's the humbling part. With all our sensors and simulations, the feel of the thing eludes us. The weight, the balance, the way it moves in the hand, the way it sounds. One blacksmith, after months of forging, held up his blade and shook his head. "It's beautiful," he said, "but it's not right. So what is missing?" Some blame materials. Ancient iron ore, with its unique mineral mix, is hard to source today. Others point to the forging environment itself: humidity, airflow, even the rhythm of the smith's hammer. A few go deeper, suggesting that the real secret lies not in the steel, but in the silence. That is, maybe the monks or whoever made the true Ulfberhts worked without distraction, with time, with purpose, in a world that moved slower. And that, more than temperature or chemistry, made the difference. We'll never know for sure, but the pursuit continues. And it's not just about swords. Engineers studying Ulfberhts have applied their insights to modern metallurgy. The way that the Vendere blades absorbed shock, it's influencing designs for aircraft wings. The microstructure of the steel, it's helping refine surgical tools. So in a strange way, the ancient sword is shaping the future, and maybe that's fitting, because Ulfberht was never just about the past. It was about better, pushing limits. Quiet excellence. And the name lives on. A startup in Finland now makes AI-optimized knife blades under the Ulfberht name. A sculptor in Oslo forges metal trees using crucible steel and signs his work with a Sayan's work with a feigned hidden cross. And at a museum in Bonn, a child stares at the original blade through glass, her breath fogging the case. She doesn't know the chemistry, but her eyes widen just the same, because that's the real power, not the cut, not the edge, but the wonder. In the next part of our journey, we drift back to the places where the swords were found: bogs, rivers, crypts, and explore what the final resting places of Ulfberht blades might be trying to tell us. Because when something is thrown into water, It's rarely by accident. Water swallows memory, slowly, softly, until what once was sharp becomes silent. And that's where many Ulfberht swords have been found, not on battlefields, not in castles, but resting quietly in rivers, lakes, and bogs, hidden, forgotten, or maybe purposefully placed. Take the River Weser in northern Germany. In 1981, a fisherman spotted something protruding from the muddy riverbank during a particularly dry summer. What he pulled out looked like a bent piece of iron, but within hours, archaeologists confirmed what it truly was: an Ulfberht blade. Its hilt was gone, the point slightly warped, but the etching remained. Plus ULFBRHT plus, clear, defiant, still resisting. The rust after 1,000 years underwater, but why was it there? Historians still debate whether these swords were lost in combat or thrown in as offerings. Some argue that flood battles were common, and losing a blade in a river wouldn't be unusual. Others point to the repeated pattern of ritual weapon depositions across northern Europe, where swords, shields, even chariots were deliberately placed in watery graves. And the timing? Most of these drowned Ulfberhts date from the 10th century, the final breath of their creation. As if, once the secret was lost or no longer needed, the remaining blades were quietly returned to the elements. Returned, not discarded. There's a difference. Consider the sword found in Lake Nemi, Italy. Far from Viking territory, this Ulfberht was discovered in a sunken wreck among Roman-era artifacts and Byzantine trinkets. Experts believe it was a diplomatic gift that never reached its destination, or a war prize. Or maybe something stranger, a sacrifice made at the edge of the known world. The lake had been sacred to the Romans. Offering a blade like that etched, rare, northern might have been seen as appeasement, or reverence, or an act of closure. And then there's the bog blade of Jutland, unearthed in 2004. It was found buried deep, wrapped in cloth, stabbed upright into peat. Unlike others, it bore no visible damage. The steel was nearly pristine, almost like it was buried before use. Why? Maybe the owner died before war came. Maybe he couldn't wield it. Or maybe, just maybe, he was told not to. Some believe the monks, or whoever controlled the secrets of the Ulfberht forge, had a ritual for failed apprentices. If you couldn't master the fire, your blade, if forged at all, was sealed forever. Not melted, not broken, but laid to rest. Given to the ground, not for shame, but for safekeeping. Because the steel was still sacred. It's poetic, isn't it? A sword that kills. Also being honored in peace. In Finnish lore, there's a story of a smith who made a blade so powerful it frightened the gods. To restore balance, he sailed it to the edge of the sea and let the waves take it. No battle, no blood, just surrender. That story was passed down in lullabies. And maybe it's no coincidence that Ulfberht blades continue to surface in these liminal places between land and water, between life and myth. One theory suggests that these deposits weren't just ritual. They were messages. Burying a blade in the earth says, "This is done." But giving it to the water says, "This belongs to time now." The difference is subtle, but it lingers, because water doesn't keep secrets. It dissolves them, or, when it's ready, gives them back. The Thames has offered up 2 Ulfberht blades over the centuries. One found in the 1800s during the dredging of a dock. the other in 1993 wedged between river stones near London Bridge. Both were dated to the 10th century. Both bore the name. Both were bent, but not broken. Some suggest they were part of Viking raids. Others suspect they were discarded during conversion when old symbols were feared, destroyed, or hidden. But here's the twist. The Christian tradition also has water rituals, baptism, cleansing, transformation. Could it be that some Ulfberht swords once, symbols of power, were offered to rivers not just in fear, but in hope? A way to sanctify the steel, to lay it down with grace. We'll never know, but it's telling how many Ulfberhts ended up submerged, sealed, or silenced, and how few survived in collections, halls, or shrines. That's not an accident. It's a whisper. And one final detail, too. Consider. Many Ulfberhts recovered from water still show visible inscriptions. Despite centuries in mud and moisture, the name endures, etched deep, forged hard, immune to time's slow teeth. Maybe that was the point. To make something that couldn't be erased, even if forgotten, even if drowned. And in the next and final chapter of our journey, we return to the blade itself. One last look at what it means, what it leaves behind, and why, when the world sleeps, a name like Ulfberht still flickers like fire beneath the surface. Night falls gently on the museum floor. The lights dim. The echo of footsteps fades. And behind a pane of glass, one last Ulfberht blade rests in silence. No crowds, no explanations. Just a curve of steel, a name etched deep, and something unspoken in the air around it. This is where our journey ends, not with fire or clangs of battle, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that lets memory rise to the surface like breath through water. Look closer. The blade is not pristine. The tip is worn. The edges show faint pitting, like tiny echoes of time. But the name? The name is perfect, plus Ulfberht, plus not scratched, not scribbled, forged. And it's here, in this quiet, that the final meaning begins to take shape. For centuries, the Ulfberht sword was seen as an object rare, elite, expensive. Something to hold, to swing, to study. But maybe it was never meant to be. Understood only with hands. Maybe it was meant to be felt. Because the more you follow its story, from snowy battlefields to monastery shadows, from icy rivers to glowing labs, the more you begin to see the pattern, not just in the steel, but in the people. The monk who carved the rings beneath the chapel, the warrior who vanished into the storm after Lechfeld, the blacksmith who sealed the blade in peat instead of letting it be misused, the modern scientist who whispered it knew what it wanted to be. And even now, that feeling lingers. That strange magnetic pull, the reason historians still argue, the reason craftsmen still try, the reason 1,000 years later, someone will sit awake at midnight wondering, how did they do it? Not just how they made it strong, but how they made it matter, because that's the real secret. It wasn't only the steel. It was the intent behind it, the care, the silence, the impossible commitment to something pure, even in an age of chaos. And maybe that's why no one can truly replicate it, not because the methods are lost, but because the world has changed. We rush. We multitask. We demand efficiency. But the Ulfberht was born in slowness, in heat and shadow, in the careful decisions of someone who wanted to make one thing right. That's what's sacred about it, not the sword itself, but the idea it carried, that excellence matters, that truth can be forged, and that sometimes the most powerful things don't shout, they stand still. The name Ulfberht has become more than a name. It's become a mirror, a way to ask ourselves what we're making and why. Whether we're swinging swords or shaping lives, the question remains, are we forging with purpose? Are we leaving something behind that time can't erase? Because that's what the monks did, what the smiths did, what the unknown hands who buried the Tillute, played in the bog did. They cared. They whispered through iron dot, and if you listen closely now, you can still hear it, a faint hum, a breath beneath the name dot plus ULFBERHT plus, and maybe that's the real reason we're still telling this story, not because of the steel, but because it reminds us what it means to be human, to reach, to wonder, to make something lasting. Sleep well now. The fire has cooled, the hammer is silent, and the blade, faithful as ever, keeps its quiet watch beneath the stars. The story of the Ulfberht Sword begins in flame and shadow, but it ends in quiet reflection. Over 15 parts, we've traveled across continents in centuries, from the forges of medieval monasteries to the frozen fields of battle, from riverbeds and museum vaults to the minds of modern smiths and scientists. What we found was not just a blade of extraordinary strength and clarity, but a symbol, an artifact of ambition, devotion, and mystery. Ulfberht was never simply a weapon. It was a message in metal, a pursuit of excellence long before the world had the tools to measure it. Its creation demanded not just technical skill, but patience, purpose, and something nearly sacred, belief. Belief in the process, belief in the craft, belief that what you make with your hands can carry meaning beyond your time. And though we may never know every detail, who forged the first blade, where the knowledge came from, or why the name faded so suddenly, the echo remains. In every failed replica, in every river offering, in every whisper of steel swung through the dark, today we still chase what Ulfberht represents. Not perfection, but intentionality, a standard. A reminder that the most powerful legacies are often quiet, often buried, and often waiting patiently to be remembered. So let this story stay with you, not just as history, but as something to carry. The next time you create, or strive, or wonder if it matters, remember the hum of a sword forged 1,000 years ago, and the name no one could erase. Plus ULFBERHT plus goodnight, traveler. The forge is still warm somewhere, and the story never really ends.